All right, so today I'm going to begin the book of Frindle. So this is going to be your first day with Frindle. I'm going to read chapter 1 and then we're going to go over the first two questions, and then you're going to be responsible for reading chapter 2 and answering the remainder of the questions. So chapter 1 begins on page 1. It's entitled Nick. If you ask the kids and the teachers at Lincoln Elementary School to make 3 lists, all the really bad kids, all the really smart kids, and all the really good kids, Nick Allen would not be on any of them. Nick deserved a list all of his own, and he knew it. Was Nick a troublemaker? It's hard to say. One thing's for sure, Nick Allen had plenty of ideas, and he knew what to do with them. One time in 3rd grade, Nick decided to turn Mrs. Deaver's classroom into a tropical island. What kid in New Hampshire isn't ready for a little summer in February? So, first, he got everyone to make small palm trees out of green and brown construction paper and tape them onto the corners of their desks. Mrs. Deaver had only been a teacher for about 6 months, and she was delighted. Oh, that's so cute. The next day, all the girls wore paper flowers in their hair, and the boys wore sunglasses and beach hats. Mrs. Deaver clapped her hands and said, "Oh, it's so colorful." The day after that, Nick turned the classroom thermostat up to about 90 degrees with a little screwdriver that he had brought from home. All of the kids changed into their shorts and t-shirts with no shoes. And when Mrs. Deaver left the room just for a minute, Nick spread out about 10 cups of fine white sand all over the classroom floor. Mrs. Deaver was surprised again at just how creative her students could be. But the sand got tracked into the hallway where Manny, the custodian, who did not think it was creative at all, he stomped down to the office. The principal followed the trail of sand, and when she arrived, Mrs. Deaver was teaching the hula to some of the kids near the front of the room, and a tall, thin, shirtless boy with chestnut hair was just spiking a Nerf volleyball over a net made from 6 t-shirts tied together. The 3rd grade trip to the South Seas ended suddenly, but that didn't stop Nick from trying to liven things up again. Lincoln Elementary needed a good joke once in a while, and Nick was just the guy to deliver it. About a year later, Nick made great Blackbird Discovery. One night he learned on a TV show that the red-winged blackbirds gave this high-pitched chirp sound when a hawk or some other danger comes near. Because of the way the sound travels, the hunter bird can't tell where the high-pitched chirp is coming from. The next day, during silent reading, Nick glanced at his teacher, and he noticed that Mrs. Avery's nose was curved, kind of like the beak of a hawk. So, Nick let out a high, squeaky blackbird peep. Mrs. Avery jerked her head from the book and looked around. She couldn't tell who did it, so she just said, "Shh," to the whole class. A minute later, Nick did it again, louder. Peep. This time, there was a little giggling from the class, but Mrs. Avery pretended not to hear the sound. About 15 seconds later, she slowly stood up and walked to the back of the classroom. Without taking his eyes off his book and without moving at all, Nick put his heart and soul into the loudest and most annoying chirp of all. Peep! Mrs. Avery pounced. "Janet Frisk, you stop that this instant." Janet, who was sitting 4 rows away from Nick, promptly turned white and then crimson. "But it wasn't me. Honest." There was a catch in Janet's voice, as if she might cry. Mrs. Avery knew that she had made a mistake and she apologized to Janet. But someone is asking for big trouble, she said. Mrs. Avery looking more like a hawk every second. Nick kept reading and he didn't make another peep. At lunchtime, Nick talked to Janet. He felt bad that Mrs. Avery had pounced on her. Janet lived in Nick's neighborhood and sometimes they played together. She was good at baseball and she was even better at soccer than most of the kids in the whole school, boys or girls. Nick said, "Hey, Janet, I'm sorry you got yelled at during reading. It was my fault. I was the one making the sound." "You did?" said Janet. "But how does Mrs. Avery think that it came from me?" So Nick told her all about the blackbirds and Janet thought it was pretty interesting. Then she tried making a peep or two and Janet chirps were even higher and squeakier than Nick's. She promised to keep everything a secret. For the rest of Nick's fourth grade year, at least once a week, Mrs. Avery heard a loud peep from somewhere in her classroom. Sometimes it was a high-pitched chirp, and other times it was a very high-pitched chirp. Mrs. Avery figured out who was making the sound, and gradually she trained herself to ignore it. But she still looked like a hawk. To Nick, the whole thing was just one long and successful science experiment, and Janet Frisk enjoyed it too. So we're going to look at the two questions that you should see. Question number 1, it says, what event caused Mrs. Denver to be delighted? So as I go back in the text, I'm looking for that particular event. I'm looking to see where is it that Mrs. Denver was delighted. And if I go back to page 1, from the bottom of page 1, moving on to page 2, it says that Mrs. Denver had only been a teacher for about 6 months and she was delighted. So I want to see what happened before that actually made her delighted. I'm going to start about halfway down page 1. One time in 3rd grade, Nick decided to turn Mrs. Denver's room into a tropical island. What kid in New Hampshire isn't ready for a little summer in February? She got so first he got everyone to make small palm trees out of green and brown construction paper and tape them into the corners of their desks. Mrs. Denver, who had only been a teacher for about 6 months, and so she was delighted. So I'm looking to see. I see that Nick has convinced his classmates to make construction paper trees from brown and green and put them on the corners of the desk. And so after that, it says that Mrs. Denver was delighted. So I'm going to look at my answer choices. A, it says the students were spiking a Nerf volleyball over a net. Well, that is something that happened, but that's not what happened before the text says that she was delighted. B, sand got tracked into the hallway. Again, that is an event that happened, but it did not happen before it says that Mrs. Denver was delighted. C, Nick turned the thermostat up to about 90 degrees. Again, something that happened, but that's not what happened before Mrs. Denver became delighted and would have caused her to be delighted. D, it says everyone taped palm trees to the corners of their desks. That is the event that happened right before it says that Mrs. Denver was delighted. Number 2, it says, why was Mrs. Avery unable to tell who was making the chirping noises? So I go back into my text again. And as I'm looking in my text, I'm going to flip to page 3. So in that second paragraph, it begins to tell me about Nick and the things that he has learned. So I'm going to start there. About a year later, Nick made a great Blackbird Discovery. One night, he learned on the TV show that red-winged blackbirds gave a high-pitched chirp when a hawk or some other danger came near. Because of the way sound travels, the hunter birds could not tell where the high-pitched chirp was coming from. So here, this could explain why Mrs. Avery is also unable to hear and be able to clearly identify where the sound is coming from. Because it says halfway through that paragraph, that last sentence, because of the way sound travels, the hunter bird, or Mrs. Avery, couldn't tell where the high-pitched chirps were coming from. So now I'm looking at my answer choices. It says A, like hunter birds, the chirping only occurred outside during recess. Well, I know that's definitely not the correct answer because this was happening inside the classroom while she was teaching and the kids were supposed to be learning. B, like hunter birds, it was hard to determine where the high-pitched noise came from. Possibly because that was the reason that was given to us on page 3. So I still need to go through and look at my other answer choices. C, like hunter birds, the chirping only occurred at dismissal. No, it didn't just happen when the kids were getting ready to leave. And D, like hunter birds, Mrs. Avery could not hear the sound. She heard it, but she couldn't tell where it was coming from. So my best answer choice is like hunter birds, it was hard for her to determine where that sound was actually coming from. So we just worked through chapter 1. You are now going to move to chapter 2, Mrs. Granger. You're going to read all of chapter 2 and answer the rest of the questions.